Hello everybody and welcome to this video for A-Level Politics, focusing on component 1 on political parties. In particular, we're going to look at the Labour Party. So there are a number of key things that you need to know. So you need to know about the historical development of the Labour Party, and I'm going to look at its origins. I'm going to look at the ideas of old Labour and social democracy. I'm going to look at New Labour and the Third Way. I'm going to then look at Miliband, Corbyn and Starmer. And I'm then going to go on and look at the ideas and current policies. There's a slight kind of problem with that in that these are current policies as of 2019. So I've used the 2019 manifesto. These are quite likely to be out of date quite quickly as we move from Starmer to Starmer from Corbyn. So we're going to look at economy, law and order, welfare and foreign affairs. You need to keep up to date with these as these change, and they will change. And this is always one of the problems of as soon as you commit anything into a video or a textbook or whatever else in politics or worksheet, then it goes out of date. So you need to watch what Starmer and his party do and whether these ideas develop. Right, so the bit that won't change. We'll start with the origins of the Labour Party. So they grew out of a series of socialist groups from the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, including the Independent Labour Party, the Fabians, and the Social Democratic Federation. These socialist groups combined and worked with the trade union movement, in particular Trade Unions Congress. It started with kind of individual unions joining up, and then they moved to the Trade Union Congress, and it was when they got support from that it's the early stages of the Labour Party became a reality. The first stage of it was the Labour Representation Committee that was created in 1900 with the aim of gaining working class representation in Parliament. And 94% of the membership of this, the LRC, came from affiliated trade union members. So these were people who were part of a trade union, and that trade union would then sign up to affiliate to support the Labour Party, and therefore the members of the trade union also became members of the Labour Party itself. Now, it was a bit of a struggle to get working class members of Parliament at this point in time, and we'll look at that in more detail in a second. And the party name changed in 1906 and it became the Labour Party. Right, the first Labour MP was a guy called Keir Hardie. That first name might sound familiar, and there's a reason for that, because our current Labour leader, Keir Starmer, was named after him. Now, Keir Hardie was one of the very first working class MPs in Parliament. There's a lot of stuff written about how he really stood out. He dressed quite in an unusual way with a deerstalker hat. Now, there's a couple of reasons why working class MPs were really, really rare. The first is MPs at this stage were not paid, and the payment of MPs doesn't come in until 1912. And the vast majority of the working class at this point also did not have the vote. So you're not really going to have a significant working class party at this time, given those circumstances, because working class men couldn't afford to stand for Parliament, because they couldn't afford to live without a wage, and things didn't really start to change on this until A, payment of MPs came in, and B, there was a large enough working class vote for the party to be viable and win a large number of seats. Now, the party starts to come into a position where it can be successful in 1918 with the Representation of the People's Act. In the same year, they wrote a new constitution, and that constitution included Clause 4. Now, this is one of the most famous clauses of the constitution of the Labour Party, because it commits the party to socialism, or at least to say it did. It doesn't anymore. It's been changed. And it reflected on the idea that the Labour Party believed in common ownership, so that's like nationalisation of industry, and it believed in redistribution of wealth, that you shouldn't have very rich and very poor, but that you should essentially do the bit like the Robin Hood effect, tax the rich and give that money to the poor. Following the Representation of the People's Act, the Labour Party seemed to started to get some success, and under Ramsay MacDonald, it formed two minority governments, one in 1924 and one in 1929 to 31. Possibly the worst time in British history to win an election, 1929, because they won the election. Then there was the Wall Street crash, and that led into the Great Depression. So the Labour Party starts from very, very small origins and quite quickly becomes a force in British politics. Now, the real era of Labour as a growing force really comes after World War II. And the Labour government of 1945 to 51 is a really significant one. It brings about some fairly major changes, including the creation of the NHS, nationalisation of industry, and these industries included coal, steel, power and civil aviation. The creation of a really comprehensive welfare system designed to look after people from cradle until grave, and this is based on the report of a Liberal lord known as Lord Beveridge that was written in 1942 during the Second World War. So this old version of Labour is definitely socialist. It's got the Clause 4s going back to 1918. We can see Clause 4 in action now with the Labour government of 45 to 51. But it's a moderate form of socialism known as social democracy. And we can see because they did not seek to remove capitalism altogether. Instead, what they looked to do was to manage it through what's known as Keynesian economics. These again go to a liberal economist called John Maynard Keynes. And what that suggested was that the main aim of the economy and the government policy should be ensure that there is full employment, that everybody can get a job. And this goes back to the Beveridge report as well, because one of the great giants, or 5 great giants that Beveridge wrote about, was idleness. So what you need to do is you need to make sure your working population can get a job. And the Labour governments going through from 45 through to 79 focus very greatly on equality of opportunity through things like comprehensive schools, rather than complete equality of outcome. So there was redistribution of wealth. There were some nationalised industries, but not the whole of the economy was nationalised. Capitalism was still there. They looked to moderate capitalism through government controls and government intervention. But these ideas then were not only carried out by the Labour Party, a lot of these ideas were actually accepted by the Conservatives during the same time in what was known as the post-war consensus. Now, there was huge amounts of problems in the 1970s, including an awful lot of problems to do with inflation and the trade unions. And following this winter of discontent of 1979, the Labour Party suffered a defeat. And after that, it did a bit of kind of wondering about its future, a bit of navel gazing, and they decided that what they needed to do was to move to the left. And that's what they did under a leader known as Michael Foot. And in 1983, they had a terrible, terrible election. They moved massively over to the left. And the manifesto of 1983 is often referred to as the longest suicide note in history. And at that point, Labour really go into absolute crisis. So they've lost in 79, they've lost again in 83, and the Thatcherite government are in absolute control. And there's very little sign of the Labour Party being able to do anything about it. So there is a period of adjustment which takes place under Neil Kinnock and then under John Smith, and they started to bring the Labour Party away from the extreme version of 1983 and back to a more kind of moderate version of the Labour Party, reflective of how they had been back in the 1960s and 70s. But this movement to a more moderate left-wing position failed to gain any electoral success. Now that shifts with the rise of Tony Blair after the 1992 defeat, and he did fundamentally change the Labour Party and what became known as New Labour, and following a new type of ideological approach which was referred to as the Third Way. And there is debate about whether this really is socialism at all. And part of the reason for that argument was he altered Clause 4 in 1995, and he removed the commitment to public ownership and redistribution of wealth. So the new ideology was still about equality, but inequality in a different way. It's embraced capitalism as a way of generating money for the economy and for the people. And under this at this time, Blair also moved Labour's focus away from being purely a party of the working class to being a catch-all party that appealed across all classes. And it's sort of this kind of pragmatic approach to try and give equality of opportunity and equality in that way, and moving away from the old kind of Labour staples of high taxation for the rich, very generous welfare states, and nationalised industry. There was a whole range of really interesting new policies that came out of the Third Way. So Blair's government started the devolution move with Wales and Scotland. They introduced the minimum wage, which is something that remains and has had a significant impact in the UK. They used PFI, Private Finance Initiative, where they continued funding public services or trying to improve public services, but often they would build schools and hospitals using private money. And they also brought in, for example, EMA, so Educational Maintenance Allowance, which was a stage where the government actually paid people to be A-level students. So you'd get about £35 a week, depending on your family income, just to be in school. So something which, if you're watching this because you're studying A-level politics, you might think of as being quite a good idea. So Blair won the election in 97 with a huge landslide and repeated that landslide in 01, slightly reduced majority in 05. So by far and away, he is the most successful Labour leader in terms of winning elections. No other Labour leader has won 3 elections in a row. But there was definitely lots of controversies when he was leader. There was stuff to do with donations from Bernie Ecclestone from Formula One and potential corruption there and cash for honours scandals. But obviously the biggest scandal under Blair, the one of the most controversial actions, was his support of the USA and the war in Iraq. So Gordon Brown took over from Tony Blair in 2007. He started to move the Labour Party slightly back towards its kind of social democratic ideology, but this was kind of shortened rather dramatically because we then faced the world economic crisis, the huge crash of 2008, and the Labour Party at that point are left reeling from the impact of that. So we then move into our next stage. In the next stage we see Ed Miliband and then Corbyn and now Starmer. So Miliband took control following the 2010 defeat suffered by Brown. He was labelled probably unfairly by the right-wing press as Red Ed. He wasn't particularly radically left-wing at all, actually, Ed Miliband. He was often quite cruelly referred to as the wrong Miliband, having defeated his brother in the leadership election based on trade union support, whilst the consensus of a lot of people, particularly a lot of people in the media, is that his brother David Miliband would have made a more effective leader. Miliband, not necessarily particularly on policy issue, but on leadership issues, failed really to capture public support, became a bit of a figure of fun for some of the press. There's a particular difficulty in eating a bacon sandwich, which you might see. And then if we move on to Corbyn, now following the electoral defeat in 2015, Corbyn completely bolt out of the blue, really unexpectedly wins the leadership contest. And this is then part of the Labour Party having lost elections, going, well, maybe the answer is moving to the left again. And Corbyn substantially moves the Labour Party back to the left. He has strong support amongst a lot of the Labour Party's grassroots, particularly a group that emerges called Momentum. And he does attract lots of new young members to the Labour Party. But he fails to win elections, and he failed marginally in 2017 and then catastrophically in 2019 to defeat the Conservative Party, whilst the Conservative Party appeared to be weak and divided over Europe. And so this really is a time when Labour should have thrived and been more successful, a lot of political commentators have argued, and his failure to beat May in particular in 2017 can be seen as a great failing, and Corbyn by the end was really only attractive to the hardcore left-wing Labour supporters, and he lost a lot of support of the moderates in the middle, and also a lot of areas in 2019 that have traditionally been Labour for many years, for generations, turned their back on the Labour Party. So Keir Starmer has taken over as the new leader, and he's expected to move the party back towards the centre, though how much or how close to the centre they will move is unclear. He's not a Blairite, so we're not really going to see a complete return to the third way, we don't think, but he's definitely not a Corbynite either, on the kind of far left of the party. There does seem to be there's a great deal of potential for conflict with the far left of the party, as we've already seen the sacking of Rebecca Long-Bailey, as Starmer looks to deal with the anti-Semitism issue within the Labour Party. So Starmer, it's difficult to say. I mean, he's not been leader for a huge length of time, and also we've been in the middle of a phenomenal, unprecedented pandemic and crisis. So exactly where he's going to take the Labour Party as we move to slightly more normal times, assuming we do move to slightly more normal times, will be really interesting to see. And this again is something that you need to keep on top of. In particular, as I'm about to go through a series of policy areas which the spec says you need to have a good idea on. And what I've done is I've taken the stuff that I just used with the previous year group, or stuff that we've just taken from the 2019 manifesto. So it's not hugely out of date as I speak to you now in 2020, but with a new leader in position, this is likely to change quite a lot over the next year or two. So Corbyn was committed to nationalising key industries, the six big energy firms, the national grid, water industry, Royal Mail, railways, and the broadband arm of BT. There was talk of the idea of free broadband. Now, whether those remain the policies of the Labour Party, it is not 100% clear at the moment. He talks about raising minimum wage up to £10, and that would boost the wages of anybody over the age of 25. He talks about spending a huge amount of money building new council houses, free bus travel for under 25s, abolishing the charitable status of private schools. So a series of very, very left-wing economic policies. They were Corbyn's policies. Whether they remain the policies under Starmer is not 100% clear. In terms of welfare policy, again, this is from 2019, talk of scrapping universal credit. I think that still will be Labour Party policy because of the difficulties and hardships that it's brought. Corbyn's policy was then to create this national care service, a community-based, personal-centred support, including free personal care. Again, social care is high on the agenda given the impact of COVID-19. So again, I think that's something that is likely to stay in place. A really, really potentially expensive one is the idea of stopping pension age rises, something that maybe won't concern you, but it's definitely something that will be attractive to those who are a bit older. And that is stopping the pension age keep on creeping up, and make a kind of limit at 66, and then look at the retirement ages for people in arduous and stressful jobs, and maybe reducing those. And they talked about an increase in the health budget, and an attack on any private provisions within the NHS. So again, it's hard to tell exactly how much of that will remain, but I think maybe on this idea, more of this is likely to stay with Starmer's Labour Party than maybe some of the economic policies. On law and order, there's a lot less to say in terms of what they do. The Labour Party under Corbyn opposed the cut in police numbers and promised to increase the number of policemen if they got into power. Corbyn's focus was more on dealing with what he saw as the causes of crime in terms of poverty and inequality, and he would be seen as rejecting what was the new Labour stance, which was tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime. You'd accept the socialist movement to be tough on the causes of crime, which was more Corbyn's line, and you'd expect the Conservative side of it to be tough on crime. And so Blair was somewhere in between, doing a bit of both, whilst Corbyn would be more on looking at causation. Corbyn was also plagued with lots of accusations of links to various terrorist groups, and therefore in his past, and therefore accusations that he would be soft on some of the most serious crime. In foreign policy, the Labour Party policy going into the 2019 election was to hold a second Brexit referendum. Again, depending on when you're watching that might be becoming very, very old news. Corbyn seemingly, maybe reluctantly, followed the mainstream of his party but it seemed very unclear to voters what the exact stance was. Starmer obviously was in charge of the Brexit policy, and he was a lot clearer in terms of a very pro-EU stance. So it will be interesting where Starmer will go in terms of future relationship with the EU when he's leader. Corbyn had a lot of ideas from it, particularly earlier in his political career, opposed to opposing UK membership of NATO, opposing UK's Trident nuclear missile programme. Now, unilateral nuclear disarmament and withdrawing from NATO did not become Labour Party policies under Corbyn, and again, with Starmer, we're likely to have a change of line and a kind of, we're not going to go anywhere near those extreme policies like dropping out of NATO or nuclear disarmament. But we are likely to see a Labour Party that is looking for a positive relationship with the European Union. Right, thank you very much for watching. I hope that's been of use to you and helps you understand the Labour Party and how it got to the current position that it's in, and some of the ideological aspects that underpin it, and also a little bit about fairly current policies. Again, this is something you need to keep yourself updated on. Please like the video, please leave me some comments, and most importantly, please support me in trying to get this this job of covering the whole of A-level politics, and subscribe, and that will then mean if you subscribe and turn notifications on, you will know when the next video drops, and you've got more stuff to watch to help you with your A-level in politics. Right, thank you very much for watching.